Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. is in conversation with the Reverend Canon Blair Pogue and the Reverend Dwight Zscheile. Blair is the Canon for Innovation for the Episcopal Church in Minnesota. In that capacity, she helps congregations all over the state go deeper in their practice of the Christian faith and rethink how they form disciples and engage the communities surrounding their church. She also runs learning communities for Episcopalians wanting to learn how to form Christian community with neighbors where they live, work, and play. Before joining Bishop Craig Loya's staff, she was the rector of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in St. Paul for 16 and a half years. And before that, she served 2 churches in the Diocese of Virginia with a special focus on Christian formation. Dwight is professor of congregational mission and leadership at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is editor, author, or co-author of many different books, including Embracing the Mixed Ecology, Inherited and New Forms of Christian Community Flourishing Together with Blair Pogue, along with Leading Faithful Innovation, Following God into a Hopeful Future. He has served congregations in Minnesota and Virginia. Dwight's experience growing up in a secular home in California has shaped his commitment to helping the church cultivate Christian community with neighbors in today's changing world. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. Your support means a lot to us in making this podcast possible.
Hello, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and today I am pleased to be joined by Dwight Zscheile and Blair Pogue. Hello, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, thanks so much for making this work. Here we are recording right after the new year. So it's January 2nd in our world. So I guess Happy New Year to everyone out there. And whatever time and place you find this and you find yourself listening to it, I hope this is a meaningful conversation for y'all. But before we get too far into the conversation, I always like to take a moment to introduce our guests and who they are and where they come from. Dwight, why don't you begin just kind of sharing about yourself and your faith journey, what that's looked like in the past and what that looks like today?
Yeah, so I grew up in a secular home on the California coast, came to faith as a young adult, and have kind of made my way through a variety of Christian traditions along the way. So I like to think of myself as having a very kind of ecumenical soul in that sense, but landed in the Anglican tradition, and that's where my home is these days, and have again, taught at Luther Seminary for many years among the Lutherans, and really appreciate their tradition. But yeah, so that's sort of a bit about my journey.
Blair, how about you?
I have a pretty similar story. Also raised in a secular home, but one where my parents said, "We want you to find the truth for yourself." So they really let me go out there and explore. And it was through a woman who met me on my high school campus when that was allowed. And I was introduced to the Christian faith through Young Life. And then over time, was involved with InterVarsity, probably the most intellectual InterVarsity chapter ever, led by a person with a philosophy PhD. And it really saved my faith. Young Life played a critical role, but I was interested in the intellectual side of faith and wrestling with tough questions. But again, like Dwight, journeyed through many different Christian traditions, and am thankful for each of them for their specific treasures.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing. Share, if you would, kind of any spiritual practices you find meaningful or are willing to share.
Well, one of the ones I've been doing for the last year or so is scripture before screens. So every morning when I wake up, before I turn on any of those devices, I spend time in the Word with a old school traditional printed Bible, and in prayer as well, as a way to kind of get rooted and stay sane and anchored in this digital world that we live in.
Okay, Dwight, I need to ask a follow-up question before, Blair, we move on to you, because I tried to do this like 6 months, 9 months ago, where I put like a physical Bible next to my bed, but I've not overcome that internal friction of like, it's always dark when I'm waking up. I don't necessarily want to wake up my wife by turning on a light. And of course, conversely, my alarm clock's on my phone. So Blair, Dwight, have you overcome this? I want to hear this.
So I have a different space, so I will do it in a different room of the house where I can turn a light on. We never keep our phones in our bedroom. We always, have them in a different room anyways. And so unless we really need the alarm for a particular day. So we actually have old school, like plug-in alarm clocks as well.
Okay.
So having that different space is really important. And then after that, I can turn on the phone and see what's going on.
That's good. See, this is where I suppose working as an on-call chaplain makes it difficult because I have to have my phone there. But Blair, share if anything I can learn from, I suppose, there too for you.
Sure. The only challenge we have is competing for the same wonderful couch in the sunroom, but Dwight's usually up earlier than me, so that really helps. Same thing as Dwight. I also, thanks to John Mark Comer in his Practicing the Way courses, I've always loved silence. And when I first became a Christian, there wasn't a lot of silence in the traditions I was in. Prayer was always verbal, pretty wordy. And I was interested in centering prayer and started doing that. But John Mark Comer talks about just sitting there, maybe starting out praying with a psalm and sharing my hopes and my struggles and what I want to pray about with God, and then moving into silence. And in his words, letting God love me for about 10 minutes each day. And that has been so powerful, just being still, being with God, but not saying anything, often with my palms open in a posture of receptivity. So I've loved that. And I'm amazed how fast those 10 minutes go by. And then I also, I have about a 45-minute commute to my office each way. And so when I started my new job working for the Bishop of Minnesota, I really had to adjust because I used to have about a 45-minute period, just a real luxury of time where I'd have my coffee. I'd try to get on that couch I mentioned, and I would journal and pray and read scripture. And that has been harder past reading a chapter of the Old and New Testament and that 10 minutes of silence. So I line up apps on my phone. And my two favorite are the Daily Office, using Forward Day by Days app that inserts the scriptures for the day in there. And then I love Pray As You Go. It's very Ignatian. So they'll have some music, they'll read a passage of scripture, and then they'll have a wondering question. So I think for all of your listeners who have commutes, it's really great to see what the app world provides that could help you have that important formation time in the morning and at night.
Yeah, absolutely. These are both excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. If only for my edification, these are helpful. So let's get into the purpose of our conversation here. Dwight and Blair are both the authors of a book called Embracing the Mixed Ecology. And I suppose I didn't do this to begin with, so my apologies. If you want, I didn't even give you your proper title. So if you're Reverend or Doctor, my apologies. Share, if you would, just the full book title and what it's meant to be about.
Yeah, so the book is called Embracing the Mixed Ecology, New and Inherited Forms of Christian Community Flourishing Together. And it's a book that really, takes from the UK this concept of a mixed ecology of church, that we need lots of different forms of Christian community working together in a particular context in order to reach all the people who are there. And that idea of mixed ecology is an adaptation of a phrase initially used by Rowan Williams when he was Archbishop of Canterbury over 20 years ago, when he talked about a mixed economy of church, recognizing that the inherited parish church system in the Church of England and in the UK was meaningfully engaging some people, but a lot of other people in the neighborhood were not being connected, into it and reached by it. And so he really encouraged the development of a variety of forms of church that could together be able to embody the gospel and bring witness to the complexity of cultures and populations and generations present in a particular area. And so we found this concept, this imagination for a mixed ecology, to be really helpful to think about the U.S. context in particular, and that's really what the book's about.
Now, Blair, you both, in the build-up to the book, or in the beginning of the book, you all spend a good bit of time talking about some underlying assumptions or foundations. I think, at least as I read the book, kind of highlight or undergird what you intend to do with the rest of the book. Do you mind taking a moment just to kind of talk through those foundational understandings you have?
It's really helpful that Dwight and I grew up, not in Christian homes, and that's going to be more and more people who don't know the Christian story. But I just think about what that was like to grow up, but not have a story that I was part of that was larger than me, the story of God and God's people. And I find that I try to have a lot of friends who don't go to church. I play tennis with a lot of women who actually, a lot of ex-Catholics, but also women who have not gone to church. And as you know, Loren, humans have to make spiritual meaning of their lives. It's kind of part of how we are. I
believe so.
Made.
Yeah.
And people are looking for places to do that. And some people will show up at our traditional churches, but more and more people won't be showing up. And they're trying to find and make meaning in different places, but often because of what's going on in our culture, technology, deep loneliness, people working long hours, they can't find what they're actually looking for. So in this mixed ecology, we want to see the institutional churches strengthen, but we also know that many of them don't know how to speak to new generations and to people who've never been to church and don't know all those 25-cent theological words and need a pathway into the Christian faith and need to be listened to and need to have their questions answered. So we're really trying to encourage Christians to reach people in many different places. The other thing I was thinking about is I know quite a few people who have to work on Sunday. And I even know a woman who connected with a Facebook church because she was curious. And that was the only thing that was working for her at that specific moment. Over time, she was able to shift her work schedule and join a church in person. But it's so important for us to be trying to share the gospel of Jesus in many different ways, again, beginning with listening to our neighbors and their hopes and concerns and longings.
Yeah, that's helpful. Dwight, I think one of the things that was interesting to me about the book is it's not just sort of a cliche takedown of institutionalism and, the church is dying and we need to write it off. Talk to me about why, I think I've heard this term from you all or others before, the inherited church model or the institution, somewhat, whatever we want to call it, why that still matters regardless.
Yeah, well, so I like to think about this in terms of just contextualization or incarnation, right? So the body of Christ being culturally embodied in particular moments. And, any movement, if it's going to survive intergenerationally, needs to take institutional form to pass its life on through generations. So So I want to make sure your listeners understand we are not at all anti-institutional or romantically naive about, if we can just recover some primitive pure Jesus movement, it will all be great. The challenge is that institutions are contextualized, they're birthed in and designed for, normed around particular cultural moments. And as times change and the culture changes, it's really important that they continue to adapt. And so what we have today, we use the language of inherited church, partly because, inheritances are treasures. So the inherited church carries the riches of the tradition. And inheritances can also be complicated if you think about them within families and things like that, right? So I often speak to mainline audiences, which are composed of lots of baby boomers, right? And I'll ask them, how many of you have antiques? And lots of hands will go up. And I'll say, how many of your millennial children want your antiques? It's very few hands, right? And it can be kind of that way with church too. We have a lot of forms of institutional church that are really kind of antique in many ways. They're beautiful and they're not designed for contemporary culture. They're birthed in very different times. I always been to a lot of churches that are perfectly contextualized for the Victorian era, for instance. And so if the church is going to thrive in mission, it's got to do that adaptation. And so the mixed ecology idea says it's not an either or. We love inherited churches and the fact that they're connecting with some people and they're meaningful. There are people who like antiques, right? And again, I want to distinguish here this sort of, antique in the sense of a particular cultural vernacular, right? The substance of the faith, the traditional faith needs to stay no matter what form of church we have, right? And so it's not about reinventing the theology. It's really about how do we embody it, express it, and communicate it so that it's accessible to our neighbors. Our friend Mike Moyna says, anytime a church decides to meet at a particular time and place with a particular style of worship and language and all that, you're automatically going to exclude all kinds of people. That's just how it works, right? Yeah. So the idea of the mixed ecology is to say, yes, and we need, alongside these traditional inherited churches, lots of other forms of Christian community that are able to translate their life and the treasures of the Christian tradition and the gospel to connect with people today.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point about even in meeting at a certain time and place, you're even accidentally excluding people. Because I think there is this tendency, at least that I've seen, especially in some mainline contexts, to try to be as open and I think for good measure, for good reason. They want to be open, but I'm not sure folks always understand that whether purposeful or not, there's some amount of exclusion that's going to be bound to happen. So I'm glad you made that point. Blair, I'm thinking of too, y'all write about this in the book, this tendency within some mainline and progressive Christian circles to gain energy and vitality through political activism. Yes. And if I understood the book correctly, y'all suggest that's not such a, I'm not sure the appropriate word would be, healthy approach, I guess we'll say.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's very important to me. Start with Jesus and go from there. So often it's people get excited about something is important to them, but they don't start with Jesus. And then they start to think it's all up to them. Right. They ignore God's agency. They're not listening, discerning how God might already be involved, say, with a specific population and how they might be called to join up. But one thing I think is we, in all the Christian traditions I've been in, except for really Young Life InterVarsity, discipleship wasn't centered. And so I think that's why that is happening, and something we're trying to correct for in Minnesota, that Jesus apprenticing people into relationship with him, into his way of life is absolutely critical. And learning skills like, how do you discern the Holy Spirit's leading? And a lot of our people don't know how to do that, and it's not their fault. We have done a disservice to them. We have never taught them how to do that. So I think how we're trying to correct for this my bishop keeps saying, let's get past left and right. And what is the third way? The way of Jesus.
Yeah.
And we're trying to apprentice people into simple spiritual practices, get them into scripture, which is something, get them to dwell imaginatively in scripture, so they can truly be formed in the image of Christ. But yeah, it's really hard right now with the polarization in our country to get people out of that polarized tribal mode and say, let's look again at Jesus and what did he say and do, and how do we think he might deal with this situation? Let's look at the prophets. So we, at least in the mainline, in the Episcopal Church, and I think in many mainline traditions, and again, I'm not faulting the people in the pews or even clergy. I was trained to be an academic. I was not trained to apprentice people into spiritual practices. And I value that academic training. I think it's important. I'm not belittling it, but I didn't really know, leaving seminary, how to do the work that now feels most critical to forming Christians, to helping them participate in God's life more fully every day.
I'm thinking of, I was just listening to an episode of, I think it's The Dispatch with Jonah Goldberg, who had on Russell Moore, and made a point that I've noticed myself too. This tendency, Dwight, where when faith becomes or when social activism or political activism becomes like a stand-in for faith, like Russell Moore made the point that I tried to make myself, it quickly becomes obvious, hey, Sunday morning is really not necessary. So I don't mean to belabor this point, but I think it's a worthwhile point that in that frame of reference that I think Blair is highlighting, where it's our agency versus God's agency, Sunday morning, I believe, in that frame of mind, just becomes sort of optional and unnecessary overhead.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, we're all living in a story, and those stories shape our lives, give us meaning and purpose and energy, right? And I think the challenge for the church, the crisis for the church in the West today is that our story was carried by the society and by the culture for so many generations in the framework of Christendom, that local churches didn't really have to pay that much attention to how do you form a people, a body of believers living an alternative way of life shaped around the practices of Jesus in community together. And that is now the agenda, right? That every church is has to figure out. And so it's no surprise then that some other narratives, whether it be left or right-wing political activism, or any number or kind of therapeutic individualism, we're just here to help you feel better about yourself. All these other things that are there in the culture can take over, provide us a framework for meaning and purpose and identity. But those things are not deeply rooted, and they're not actually distinctive from what the broader culture is offering. And so I hear a lot of mainline churches that will sometimes say, well, we're just so inclusive in their own imagination of what they think that means. Or we're just we do these good works. So I'm saying,
wonderful community.
I mean, look, the military is going to be far better at diversity than most mainline churches, right? Most corporations are better now, honestly, right? The church is actually really bad at this relative to the biblical vision, the radical biblical vision of truly bringing people together across all cultures, races, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses into one body of believers, right? So, so there's a lot of ways in which the rest of the society looks and says, well, why would I need to join that community to have this other good that isn't actually intrinsic, to following Jesus in this way? There are other institutions that are better at doing it. Now, of course, those values of equality and inclusion in the broader society come from Christianity originally, right? That we often forget that. And the church, if it's not practicing a way of life together that is a life characterized by hope, in a time of despair, by togetherness in a time of isolation, by mutual service and unconditional love for one another in a time of such self-centeredness, a time of abundance, a practice of abundance in a time of scarcity and fear, et cetera, et cetera. If it isn't practicing that way of life that Jesus was about, then it doesn't have much of a hope in a time in which people are generally not joining institutions, voluntary association institutions, generationally as they once did.
Yeah. I'm glad you made the point about the kind of the milquetoast religion. I know as of the time of this recording, everybody is watching that Knives Out movie. I never have 2.5 hours for my wife and I to watch a movie together, it feels like, but we've been watching a show on Netflix called Ripple, which has some very slight Christian undertones, but I kind of did a palm face, face palm when the pastor gives this sort of really milquetoast bland, faith is just about humans loving other humans. And Dwight, I appreciate what you said. That's what I was saying to my wife, as much as I enjoyed the show. So this is, I think, the hinge point is if Christianity is more than just, a shined up version of our best human intentions of humans loving other humans. Like Blair, then what is Christianity? What is the church? What should we be then? What do y'all suggest that churches aspire to be?
I think we should be a radical countercultural community focused on Jesus. We are a community that is, I love Craig Van Gelder, who said the church should be like a demonstration plot, a sign, witness, and foretaste of God's reign, in deep relationship with neighbors, but in a posture of humble listeners. Again, listening for what God is already up to in the lives of the neighbors of the church. And I think if we really lived into that vision of being an eschatological community that is experiencing God's restoration of the human condition, everything Dwight talked about, I also thought about in an age of cancellation, forgiveness, reconciliation. That is powerful. I think that's what people are looking for. And I know we're human, but I just think that witness will be incredible. And again, starting with discipleship, and whole life discipleship, not just my quiet time in the morning, or I go to church on Sunday and I stay for the Bible study afterward, but that our whole life is impacted, and the love of Jesus is shining through us in every place we go. That makes such a difference. And being trustworthy people, in a time where there is so little trust. I see the people that I work with, they inspire me because I see them showing up in hospitals and classrooms and banks and courtrooms as Jesus's followers and making a profound difference. And people asking them, why have you made those tough ethical choices? Why did you respond in that way? So I think just our living the gospel in daily life is critical, and helping people, enabling the people entrusted our care to be able to show up in those ways.
Yeah, I can't help it. I'm rereading again Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, and he doesn't use the word. He uses God's freedom, but I certainly hear, at least if I'm understanding his writings correctly, this similar sense of God's agency. And it certainly seems in today's context, we have, broadly speaking, such a tendency to try to control God or act on, I think that we're acting on God's behalf rather than God act on us. And I think that solves so many of these problems is like you said, listening, being humble, responding to where we recognize God is already at work. So let's talk practically speaking then. Dwight, you give some in the book some practical examples of ways this might be lived out through fresh expressions, new church. Talk about some of those real practical concepts.
Yeah, so the mixed ecology has a variety of components in it. One way to imagine it would be almost like a garden, right? That you have some really tall-rooted, old oak trees. Maybe those are inherited congregations that have been around for hundreds of years, right? But also some, plants that are popping up, strawberry runners, or sort of things that are maybe a little more, experimental along the way. And so in the book, we try to map out those different components, and one of them is church plants. So
Yeah.
church plants are new Christian communities, often focused on worship that intend to become congregations, and we need a lot of them. We need way more than we have right now in the West, right? So the questions you get to ask when you're doing a church plant of what should church look like in this place among these people. What
Right.
languages should we speak? How do we communicate the gospel? Those creative questions are really, really important to ask, and they're much harder to ask in an inherited congregation, or as our listeners, I'm sure, know, much harder to change an inherited congregation. So we think church plants are really important, and we need lots of them, lots of different versions of them. That are contextualized in different ways to reach different people. And there's lots of different models for doing that, but I think it's something that is a really important element in the mixed ecology. I'm going to let Blair talk about fresh expressions in a minute, but let me just touch on digital ministry because that is, again, something that again, we live in this digital culture now, and so the church needs to be embedded there. I think part of the way we think about that is it's best when it's digital ministry has a both physical and digital dimension, right? So we're incarnational people. I think there's no replacement for actually sharing life together in our bodies in places. And I know that some people find that have a hard time access, for health reasons or others, able to be present. So I think it's wonderful that we have digital entry points and options and ways in for church, and there's a lot of creative work going on around that. We also think that there's a space for mega churches and micro churches. So mega churches, 2,000 or more on a weekend, there continue to be more of them in American culture. They're very different kinds of mega churches, often different from what people often imagine, and a lot of them are doing really powerful and effective ministry.
Yeah.
And so we think there's a real space for that. And micro churches would be the kind of, other side to that, which is, neighborhood-based, lay-led, small forms of Christian community, just doing simple things gathered around tables rather than stages. And there's a space for that as well. But Blair, would you want to talk about fresh expressions?
Sure. And I just wanted to mention in the mega churches and micro churches, I think they're doing a great job of addressing the core questions people have and the real daily questions. And they've done that often better than the mainline.
Yes.
So fresh expressions, that's, Loren, largely what I'm working with in the Diocese of Minnesota. And again, I think I can't state this enough. The operative theology here is God is already up to something in people's lives. And we have to learn what God is up to by listening. And fresh expressions involves going to where people live, work, and play, meeting them where they are. There is a whole missional journey that we follow. I've got a group of about 30, mostly lay leaders in a group called Mustard Seed. And we start with listening, loving. This is long-term work. We're not doing it to manipulate people. And more often than not, people start asking questions over time. And then from there, when there is spiritual curiosity, we're learning how to share Jesus and his way of life in accessible ways. That is a learning curve for all of us in the main line, at least where I live, work, and play. And then sometimes a church even forms. But one thing I want to make sure to say is all of our fresh expressions, or in Minnesota, we're calling them new Christian communities, even though they're not all Christian. They're kind of on that pathway, but they're all connected to an inherited church because the goal is to learn how to share the treasures. There are so many from inherited churches in accessible ways with people outside the institutional church, and then to feed back to the inherited church what we're learning. What are the questions that are coming up? What's the language people are using to talk about God, to talk about faith? I have to just quickly share this with you because I'm so excited about it. I have a woman in a suburb of St. Paul doing something called spiritual practices in nature. And she put it on Meetup, and a bunch of people signed up. And one of the people who came said, "What is God?"
Wow.
And this woman was so excited. She's also a teacher. So she said, "Oh my gosh, I have to build scaffolding around God." And I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "That's what we say as teachers when we have to learn how to explain something." So that was such a great challenge. I think we're going to see more and more of that as we become more post-Christian. But again, it's really important to me, it's important to my bishop, that these fresh expressions that can take so many forms from, you name it, a knitting group that then over time starts to ask important questions where people start to share their lives, to biking groups, canoeing groups, photography groups. We always say, do something in a hobby or something you love to do. And that connects you with people. And if you just listen to and love them, that is good in and of itself.
Right.
But it is, again, amazing how often over time, often a long period of time, people then start asking spiritual questions when there's enough trust. So we're trying to do this. And I'm so inspired by these people I'm working with, and we're learning together. I'm learning with them how to do this, but we're trying to get out there. And these are people who would largely never come to church. It wouldn't even cross their radar screen to think of coming, but we're trying to meet them where they are in something they love to do, or Dwight just did a lot of work in Wisconsin with Lutherans, and quite a few of the folks he worked with and the lay leaders he worked with found communities of people with children with special needs who just couldn't go to church because their kids were autistic and church wasn't working for them. So again, it's really, again, based in deep listening and love, true love of the neighbor, not manipulation.
Yeah. I'm thinking, the thing that's always a struggle here is the unspoken is time, is the challenge. We want these quick fixes. And I think there's this conversation happening, broadly speaking, especially in evangelical circles, of this quiet revival. And having just read the Christian Smith book on the obsolete book, like it's going to take time. And Dwight, this leads me to a practical question. When we think about judicatories and denominations, you all write in the book about things needing to become more networked. Like, I'm thinking like practical questions. How do we balance this understanding that it's going to take time? Like, I wanted to ask you too, like this bugaboo of mine that I'm tired of seeing, like, when do we need to close churches, and be like, can we stop giving away the money for the church and save it for new ministry expressions rather than giving it to a nonprofit? That's my thing. I gave you a lot there, so respond to whatever you want to.
Sure. So again, within a mixed ecology, we have to take the long view. That oak tree took a long time to get planted and to grow. The strawberry runner may be short-lived for a season, right? And so part of it, I think, is to have an imagination for, we're going to have lots of different things. Some of them are experimental. Our current systems are not designed to support experimentation. They're designed really to be regulatory agencies, or just to kind of manage from the center. That doesn't help so much. Not that we don't need good safeguarding
accountability,
policies, for instance, and things like that. Absolutely, we do. But But there has to be space that's made. And, one of the things that's the Church of England has done, I think, pretty well over the last 2 decades is to figure out a bit about how to do that. And so in the Church of England, their vision for this decade is that one of the elements of it is the mixed ecology is normative. And so they've had to create things like what they call Bishop's Mission Orders, which is a kind of category of Christian community that can be a lot of different things, different from a traditional congregation. And it gets the blessing of the bishop and it makes space for it. So we need some new categories, some flexibility with certain policies. We have to have different assumptions around, I think, lay and clergy leadership. So if we expect all these new communities to be led by professional clergy, they're going to be too expensive. If we expect them to own their own dedicated buildings, they're going to be too expensive. So things like Fresh Expressions are best typically when they're lay-led and, by someone who isn't a professional staff person because, the business model doesn't work. They can take easily 5 years to mature. A lot of church planting, particularly in the mainline, is, okay, put in a professional pastor, 3 years, you've got to have 50 or 75 or 100 people who can pay your salary. And like those expectations aren't realistic for a lot of these kinds of communities. And so, I think churches planting churches, resource churches where you have like a big group of leaders and they can pour resources in, like that can be great in some places. And you can see megachurches doing multi-site and planting in ways that is working. And a lot of the experimental work is going to be on the edges. It needs to be given different kind of permission, not the same expectations, and have a different business model. So part of this is also things like social enterprise, missional businesses, non-stipendiary clergy, a lot of, lay teams leading things. We need to break open the kind of clericalized, Christendom, professionalized models of ministry that we have inherited, because while they have a place, an important place, they shouldn't be exclusive for this situation we're in. So we talk a lot at Luther Seminary on our team about, lay-led, clergy-supported ministry rather than clergy-led, lay-supported ministry. And I think that's a shift we're seeing in a lot of places as well.
So last question here. What's coming to mind, and I'm curious what y'all think of this, having grew up conservative Baptist, like missionary work was a big ethos, and there was this understanding that certainly the goal of like a missionary was to go plant a church like eventually, but there's also like some assumptions and understandings like a missionary going to again, their words, like an unchurched or unreached people group. Like there was this idea that like it may take generational efforts. And I'm wondering, like, should we think about like some of these Fresh Expressions efforts rather than thinking like that's church, that almost more like as a missionary?
Yeah, good question. I think in a way both and.
Okay.
And sometimes this becomes, we've seen it in the UK, not so much, and this is really pretty new in the US, but sometimes you really get a powerful, small, almost more like a microchurch worshiping community that is demonstrating, that is embodying all the different ways you would think of as being a church. Plus, I think it's super important that the smaller communities are connected to a larger structure, and also have all the accountability Dwight mentioned. In fact, I'm working mostly with lay leaders, and they're all working with Episcopal priests who are on board and who are working with coaching them, who they're checking in with. So there's co-learning going on. But I think that some of the Fresh Expressions are definitely in the area of what we would have called mission work, or maybe even doing that now. Part of God's mission. But sometimes these communities can become a church on their own, and we're just seeing everything under the sun, and that's exciting. And I think also with what Dwight was mentioning, what I really love, especially about the lay leaders, is they're embedded in communities already. I hate to admit it, but in 20 years as a priest, I spent way too much time returning emails in my office. In the church, instead of being out and about, just listening to neighbors. I'm horrified by that, but that was a big part of my job. And so the lay leaders are out there, they're embedded, but the institution always wants to, even maybe like the mission agencies say, how many people have accepted Christ? How many? And again, this is how many people are coming. This is really long-term, slow work. But the fresh expressions, I could spend hours talking about them because they take about every incarnational form you can think of. But again, they're just highly contextual. And so it's neat to see there's a real spectrum from creating trustworthy relationships, listening, walking with neighbors, being involved with them, to actually becoming a small church that is ideally connected to a larger institution or a larger church.
Yeah. I know I said last question, Dwight, I've got to ask you this because I'm thinking of a book that I just read, and my co-host Martha Tatarnik had him on, William Harrison, but William Harrison had a chapter in his book where he talked about the necessity of closing churches. I mean, this is like a bugaboo, certainly in some context, something, I'll be honest, like I hate to see a church close. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so, the church is an organic phenomenon. It's an organic entity, and every local church has a life cycle, right? I mean, if you go and try to find the churches named in the New Testament today, you're going to have a hard time, right? So this is I think it's a normal part of Christian history that churches, local churches, any particular local expression of church will have a life cycle. And when churches kind of get to the end of their life cycle, which in the case of the main line is actually, there's a lot of congregations that are at the end of their life cycle right now. I mean, if you just do the math and look who's there. So they either can be their historic legacy, their assets, their building can be, replanted or reimagined with permission from the people who are there, or, different ways. And they can recontextualize and have a new life. Or, those assets, should be repurposed for some other form of Christian community. I think generally I see a lot of resources actually being kind of drained away, and just to keep open something that's already kind of zombie. Honestly, it's pretty dead, in its current form. And I think when we have communities of disciples following Jesus who are, depending upon the Spirit's leadership and practicing Jesus's way, right, as the main thing, right, that we're about, it's much easier to say, look, hey, we've got 12 people. This is a house church. Doesn't need a building and a pastor, right? So let's move it, into a house, or let's move it into a cafe or a community center or something like that. And then, is there an immigrant congregation or some newer generational, youth-focused ministry that could use that historic building, or how might it just be repurposed? And I think we need to be much bolder about that, honestly, than mostly what I see. I think a lot of leaders in the systems, bishops and others, have a real pastoral heart and really want to care for people, and and don't want to kind of rock the boat. And I don't blame them for that. And there's a lot of, kingdom resources that we're stewarding, I think sometimes in ways that aren't particularly faithful, given the opportunity we have to redeploy them, to reimagine, and to recreate in all kinds of ways. And so my friend Michael Bender, he says it's always easier, in a hospital to deal with the kind of hospice wing when the maternity wing is full of new births, right? If all we have is sort of these deaths, it's harder. So to think about how do these resources funnel into the planting of new communities, and to have the elders in those congregations to say, like, do that with our blessing. We have a heritage to give away. We don't want it to end with us. Like, that's my prayer for those communities. And my fear is that so many of them aren't actually shaped around discipleship to the point that they're able to have the spiritual freedom to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much both for your time. I chose to ask that question rather than lead into our closing questions because I really wanted to get your thoughts on that. Before we do close, though, share, if you would, just how folks can connect with you, how they can get a copy of the book, all that stuff.
Absolutely. So I have a personal website. It's just dwightzscheile.com, DWIGHTZSCHEILE.com. And that has information about all my books, and there's a contact form and things like that. And I'd love to hear from people.
Great. And if you're interested in working with Fresh Expressions and specifically learning communities, running them, how to set them up, you could reach me at blair.p@episcopalmn.org at the Diocese of Minnesota.
And the book is, again, Embracing the Mixed Ecology, and it can be found, it's published by Seabury Books, can be found on the church publishing website or Amazon or anywhere else books are sold.
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. And we always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you.
Amen. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.